started. My name is Brian Fong. I'm the Assistant Research Director of the Center of the Legal Profession. David Hogan's sends technologies. He's actually teaching in another program right now.
Close to 40 minutes.
But we are very lucky to have our fantastic postdoc fellow, John Bliss, who's going to come and talk about transitioning the practice, the formation of professional identity among U.S. and Chinese lawyers. I've actually seen a version of this, and it's really cool. There's circles involved, diameters and things like that. Pretty cool. John actually JD from Berkeley and PhD also from Berkeley. And he spent last summer actually in Shanghai interviewing a bunch of Chinese lawyers who speak fluent Mandarin about their professional identities. And I think he's going to talk a little bit about how that compares to some of his findings from U.S. lawyers. So with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you. So today I'll be asking two research questions in both the US and Chinese context. How do law students and new lawyers think about professional identity? And this, in the context of this research, really means how do you think about being a lawyer relative to other roles in your life? And the second question is, how do these conceptions change during law school? So what are your initial expectations at the beginning of law school? And how does it look as you proceed through law school and the first couple years of practice? Our understanding of these questions has largely been based in anecdotal and polemical perspectives. And what I'm doing through my dissertation research on US law school socialization, and now my postdoc research in China, is trying to bring an empirical lens through a qualitative multi-method study drawing on interviews and identity mapping, which is a method that we'll look at today, that's really designed to reveal internal experiences of identity and the formation of a professional self. So, brief roadmap for the presentation. I'll begin by defining this sociological concept of role distancing, which is key to how I'm talking about identity. Look at some of the literature on lawyer identity. If you've had PR, you may be familiar with some of this. We'll look at the methods. I'll show some US findings, and then we'll look briefly at the Chinese extension and some implications. So role distancing is Irving Goffman's classic sociological concept about the self. Don't know if there's any sociology majors in the room, but for Goffman, the self is not a given. The self is constructed. It's largely constructed through enacting roles in your daily life. You can begin to think about different roles you enact in your life, different hats you wear at work or school, in your community, racial, gender, and religious roles. And for Goffman, there's this management process where some roles you embrace in a central way. When you enact the role, you feel unself-conscious. You feel like, in Goffman's words, you disappear into the virtual self implied by the role. You feel sort of authentic. Other roles you enact, but you feel distance or detachment. Often you feel an aversion to some of the behavior required of you in the role. And what I'm interested in here is, where do law students and new lawyers locate the lawyer role on this spectrum of identification? Is it a central role? Is it more of a distant role? And how does that change? This question arises out of some of the literature on lawyer identity in the law reviews. The standard view of lawyer identity is this thin conception where the lawyer should bifurcate between a lot of their personal values and personal identity and what they're doing in their professional capacity. So in the professional capacity, you should be neutral, partisan, a zealous advocate for your client. You should not be sort of providing an individual moral screen through your own values, right? So there's this bifurcation, and it implies the kind of Goffman role distance to some extent, the idea that the professional role doesn't directly express all of your personal and political values. It should be more client-oriented. Sorry about the formatting going a little weird here, but on the thick end is the cause lawyer view, or public interest lawyer view, which is a strong critique of the standard conception for being too amoral and too apolitical, The cause lawyer view is that you can personally invest yourself in the lawyer role, that what you do as a lawyer directly expresses your politics and your values. You take responsibility for the ends of representation, and you can embrace the role. You can have this unalienated professional life in an ideal sense. It's not to say that all public interest lawyers feel that way, but this is the normative debate. We have less data empirically on how lawyers actually think about the lawyer role. And the normative scholars make divergent assumptions. People who defend the standard conception worry that lawyers invest too much in professional identity, that they're putting too much of their own values, that they're just trying to sort of realize and vindicate their own moral vision of the world. People on the cause lawyer side worry that lawyers are too amoral and bleached out, that lawyers need to draw on their contingent features of identity, racial, gender, values, et cetera. The nearest empirical studies we have are really the studies of the law school classroom. And these studies generally suggest that what you're taught in law school is the standard view. That what you're really learning in the law school classroom is that your initial moral, emotional, and political responses to the cases are the wrong answer. The right answer is the legal doctrinal answer. And you're learning, the Socratic dialogue puts you in a role-playing and sort of slippery linguistic footing where you're taking on a new voice of a legal doctrinal analyst instead of your personal opinion, right? You separate your personal opinion from the argument. And that might imply the standard conception, but this research focuses on the classroom, not as much on whether students internalize these experiences. So my research aims to fill this gap by focusing on sort of the backstage identity work of students. I do this through interviews and identity mapping with 66 students, mostly focusing on 1L and 2L, so I follow up with them in the second year to see sort of what's changed and how they think about professional identity. There's also an ethnographic component, although it's more relevant in other parts of the dissertation that we won't talk about. And the site is an elite school with a strong liberal reputation. Career options are similar to what you find at Harvard, with a big emphasis on big law and clerkships, maybe a stronger public interest reputation. So the challenge here methodologically is that talking about identity is really abstract and personal. It's hard to just walk up to someone and say, "Who are you?" And expect them to feel comfortable giving you an insightful response. Fortunately, law students are great at talking about these issues. They're great at talking about abstract questions. And if you make them comfortable and approach the issue from multiple angles, I've found that in a confidential setting, students are very forthcoming. To this end, I introduced this identity mapping exercise halfway through each interview, just to provide a spark to the conversation. So I hand the respondent a sheet of paper with a blank circle, and I ask them to place the different roles they enact in their lives on the circle. I give them the kind of Goffman role distance spiel similar to what I presented today, and I tell them to place the roles closer to the center if it's a role that they feel that expresses themselves, that it's embraced, it's proximate, it's constitutive of who they are, and further from the center if it's a role that they feel some aversion to or some distance or detachment while they're enacting the role. So this method provides visual snapshots of the self that can be compared over time. So I can see how people filled it out in the first year and the second year and beyond in a smaller sample. And they can be aggregated, but really the richest data comes from the conversations, and I'll try to give you a flavor of some of the interview conversations that are sparked by the exercise when we talk about why the roles are placed where they are, why they're labeled the way they are, what's the relationships among the roles, why they're sort of clustered in the ways that they are. And what I found is really key before we start looking at the maps. A key variable here that emerged is their job paths. So there's 3 job paths that were common in my sample. One is students who wanted to do public interest or government work, and they stated that preference in both 1L and 2L. They didn't take a big law internship. Second are students who wanted to work in big law, and they stated that preference from 1L. And third are what the literature calls the drifting students, students who state a public interest preference in 1L, but by 2L have decided to at least start their careers in big law. So we'll look at an example from each. So here's Sarah. She's in the drifting path, and this is her 2L identity map. So by drifting path, this means that in 1L, she told me she's hoping to do public interest straight out of law school. In 2L, she decided she's going to start in big law. And you can see in the center, if you can't see, I'll read it to you, she's placed daughter/family and good Catholic. Above that is hopefully impacts litigation/civil rights lawyer. And then above that to the right is big law firm job. And over here is law student. The law student's on the periphery. Big law firm job is completely outside the identity circle. It's completely outside the circle that represents who she is. And you can probably guess that her plan is to work in big law for a few years and then transition via this chronological arrow into the public interest career. You also could note that the civil rights lawyer role is more central. It's adjacent to family. It's in the central cluster. The big law role, in contrast, she describes with a great degree of distance and even fraudulence. She says, I'm trying to figure out what's the least dirty practice area within the firm. She's not really looking forward to working at the firm, right, on a sort of moral level. She takes a very harsh view of corporate law, and that's common in the drifting path. So often these students in the first year are in these strong public interest peer cliques. They share very harsh views of corporate law, and they sustain these views even after they've decided to work in corporate law themselves. Her biggest fear is, I'll get addicted to money, and you could probably guess what she means here, that she'll get sort of stuck in big law, right? That the idea of going from a fourth year, maybe you guys know the scale better than me, but $250,000 salary to a public interest salary that's 20% of that. It's reasonable to be skeptical about it, but what I want to emphasize here is this sense of moral distancing and fraudulence, that they're worried about being found out, that I'm not really a corporate lawyer, I'm a public interest lawyer. I'm going to play this role. It's this distant, detached role, but I'm going to play it from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. for a few years. And hopefully I don't get found out. So those are the kind of accounts you hear in 2L in the drifting path. So here's public interest path, 2L. And the lawyer role is labeled job here. And the first thing I want to point out is that the lawyer role is in the center. Second thing is that it's overlapping with political and family roles. So I'll read out the roles. So we have family member, job, activist, community member, National Lawyers Guild, clinic, journal, academic, and law student. Law student is on the periphery, so that's 2 for 2, that law student is not a very central role. But what I want to emphasize here is that lawyer is clustered with personal and political roles, and this really looks like the cause lawyer identity profile that you see in the normative literature, where being a lawyer draws directly on your political values, your personal values. In the interview, he says, my family is so proud of me for getting into this law school, pursuing my dream of being a social justice advocate. This really supports his integrated view of the lawyer role. The third path, students who wanted to do corporate law from the beginning of law school. Here we see the lawyer role in the periphery. Everything else is in the center. In the center, he has family, parentheses old, family, parentheses new, meaning that he's planning to have children, Defense of Marriage Act, religion, war veteran, military, politics, and lawyer. And there's an emphasis here on differentiation between work and life. He says, I came to law school to get a job. I was doing this military thing. I came here to make money, right? And these financially instrumentalized accounts of working in big law were very common in the big law path, in the sort of corporate path, students who were entering big law. The difference between these students and the drifting students on average is that although there's a differentiation between work life and sort of central real life, it's not accompanied by these accounts of moral fraudulence and moral distancing from the work, and concerns about even the habitability of being in the lawyer role. You don't hear that as much in this path. Instead, it's things like, well, this is just my first job. I'm really valuing job mobility. Maybe I'll go into in-house. Maybe becoming partner doesn't come up a ton. Which is actually borne out by the after the JD data. People don't stay in big law. Half of the associates are gone by year 7. And 7% do go back to public interest well, go back is a loaded term. 7% of people in big law by year 7 are in public interest. So there are people transitioning out of big law. So in terms of internal implications for the respondents themselves, I would say the public interest path doesn't raise too many alarms internally. They're expecting a lot of autonomy in their work. They're expecting satisfaction at work. The corporate path also doesn't raise a lot of alarms. There's sort of benign discomfort associated with role distancing. It's something that maybe we all have different levels of tolerance for role distance in our work, for doing work that doesn't directly express our values at every turn. And generally, there's a high tolerance in the corporate path. The drifting path accounts of fraudulence and moral distancing. If those are really sustained over the long hours required in big law, that might be a call for concern in terms of job satisfaction, maybe worse when we look at mental health data in the big law sector and in the profession at large. In terms of external implications, and this is really the central finding, this is the sort of the bottom line finding for the American study in terms of what I'm presenting today, students who go into big law, and here I combine the corporate and drifting path because they had similar movement in the lawyer role, tend to place the lawyer role close to the center in 1L and out on the periphery in 2L. So the dashed line is where the lawyer role was in 1L. Solid line circles are where it was in 2L. The public interest path tend to place the lawyer role in almost the same spot on average in 1L and 2L. And I term this drift in the big law students professional identity drift. And I'm specifically using the term drift to intervene in the literature which emphasizes the drift away from public interest sector career ambitions, which is arguably an important issue, although public interest job opportunities are limited in the job market. But I want to shift more normative attention to this issue of drifting away from civic and personal investment in professional identity among students headed into big law. This shows the same thing as the last graph. So this is the big law students in the orange and the public interest students in the 1L in terms of the lawyer role measurement from the center. But what I've added here is the post-JD interviews, which is a smaller sample. But it's interesting that in the post-JD interviews with lawyers in their first 3 years of practice, the role distance is similar to the 2L. So for the big law students in 1L, it's relatively central. In 2L, it's peripheral. Post-JD, it's also peripheral. So there's something going on that isn't just a moment in 2L, sort of a freak out about reconciling your initial career ambitions with your recent decision to work in big law. It's also something about how you really think about yourself as a lawyer, even into the first years of practice. I won't spend a lot of time on the external implications now, but I'm happy to share my writing on this with you. But I think there might be concerns about the social responsibilities of the bar and of the big law sector. If lawyers are not investing in civic identity, is this really an identity type that we would expect to predict a strong investment in things like being a moral watchdog over client behavior, doing pro bono, and viewing the lawyer role as a civic vocation rather than just a job? Also questions about whether this looks like a good corporate lawyer, that the big law sector, and you see this in our faculty director David Wilkins' writing, is under a lot of stress and transition and is asking for lawyers who have leadership, business acumen, vision, a long-term commitment to the survival and health of the sector and the profession at large. So do we want lawyers who say things like, I'll rent them my soul for a couple years, a couple hours of my life, if it means I get to have a good quality of life afterward? This isn't really particularly valuable perspective in this context. You could push back and say that actually big firms rely on churning out these associates every few years, but they need at least some of the associates to be invested in a tournament for partnership and in the long-term health of the sector, right? So, okay, so that's the US case, and I'll show you a couple preliminary findings from the Chinese case to put this in comparative context. So I interviewed 30 lawyers in Shanghai and did the identity maps. These are young lawyers in their first 3 years of practice in basically big law. So they're either in multinational firms or they're in elite domestic firms. And preliminary findings are on this question of how do these new Chinese corporate lawyers conceive of professional identity. I don't have the longitudinal perspective. I don't have the overtime analysis here, but I'm just talking to the young lawyers. A lot of them just have an undergraduate legal degree because, like in most civil law countries, most countries in the world, law is an undergraduate major, right? But others have a foreign LLM or a domestic master's degree. So thinking about socialization in the Chinese context, a lot of it's going to happen after law school. That's part of the reason that I start the comparison with these young lawyers who've had, often they've had a very doctrinal, black letter legal education in undergraduate. So let's start with an example. This is Chen, a first-year associate in a multinational firm, a foreign firm. In the center, she has daughter, friend, lawyer, and just outside of that is mother and wife. A few things are very representative about this example. What jumps out to you as different about this example from some of the US examples that we looked at? Absolutely. So sort of looking at it holistically, nothing's outside the circle. And that actually is true in all 30 interviews. There were no roles outside the circle, given the same instructions. Yeah.
So that they distinguish between different family members, instead of just lumping family together, they actually separated them on the scale?
Exactly. So, so family is a huge emphasis on family, and it's such a huge emphasis that most of the roles are different family roles. And the other thing I'll point out along those lines is daughter, which I didn't see, I don't think, in any of the US maps. Maybe it came up once or twice. It comes up in almost every Chinese map, daughter, son. That it's an affirmative role that you play in society, being a daughter or a son to your parent. Anything else?
It seems like the lawyer role is more important than mother or wife role. I don't know.
There's a specific contingent explanation here, which is that mother, wife are future roles for this respondent, which sometimes, so yeah. But great eye, and the other thing in what you just said is that lawyer is very central for someone working in big law, in her first year in big law. That was extremely rare in the US sample. So what's going on there? Let's look at another example. So these three across the center are girlfriend slash wife, daughter, girlfriend slash hoping to become a wife. Just to clarify, this wasn't sort of divulging her secret life. Daughter and mother, which is future role. So again, daughter is dead center. She even drew a sort of dot here to mark the center to highlight that daughter's dead center. Friend, lawyer, student, and over on the right we have more relatives. So huge emphasis on family.
And just to be clear, you didn't give the only role that you asked them to put was lawyer. Everything
Exactly.
else was completely open.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that. So I did ask them to include lawyer. Everything else is completely open. And I try not to prime them in any way. And I gave the same instructions in the US and China, given with translations. So what's going on here? The puzzle for me at the start here is that the lawyer role is relatively central, but they also describe it in highly financially instrumental terms, similar to the US corporate lawyers, maybe even more. That the best thing about being a lawyer is that I can provide for my family. I could be a breadwinner, provide even for my parents. And given that it's so financially instrumentalized that it's not an emphasis on expressing yourself, the puzzle is, wouldn't you expect it to be more of an alienated peripheral role like we see in the US case? And here's another quote, so emphasizing family. Family roles are in the center because family is the basis for all my social roles, says Zhao.
Can I ask a quick question, John?
Yeah.
In the so you said in the Chinese example, there's this idea that being a lawyer is good because I can make a lot of money and provide for my family. So there's that second clause on there.
Yes.
In the U.S. case, did you ever get that second clause? In other
Yeah.
words, why making money was actually important?
There is a big emphasis on family in the US context as well. But this is sort of family squared. This is family all over the map and all through the interview. And one factor there is sort of a deep cultural difference that you see in experimental psychological work and in classical writings from the East and West about this cultural difference, that the Confucian tradition values fulfilling a role as a deep sense of personal fulfillment. In the West, we value our autonomy and independence so much that when we enact a role, there's some sense of compromise and resistance. We push back against the role. There's some sense of compromising your freedom. And so there's some deep cultural underpinnings. There's also something specifically related to how you become a lawyer. So in the Chinese context, the decision to study law often sounds like this. My high school teacher chose the major for me. At that time, I didn't understand anything. So college entrance is based on an exam score, and you apply directly to the majors. Often students will go to sort of the best major at the best university they can get into. They don't have a lot of childhood impressions of lawyers, partly because the profession's only 20 years old almost. The private bar is only 20 years old. So it's not that their parents and their uncles and friends, family friends are all lawyers, or that they had some heroic view of lawyers. They sort of say, it wasn't my first choice. So this is a common narrative, unfortunately very common, that students said it wasn't my first choice. I'd rather have gotten into another major, but I didn't make the exam scores for that major, so I went into law as a second choice. It's particularly true in the last 10 or so years. There was an explosion in Chinese legal education around the turn of the millennium, and there was an overproduction of lawyers. Suddenly, job prospects went down, and it became a very undesirable major. And then even within law school, they don't want to be lawyers. My parents wanted me to be a civil servant, but I failed that exam. Only then I decided I want to be a lawyer. For many of us, you can see that becoming a lawyer wasn't our first choice. Nevertheless, oh, and then here's a nice quote. Someone said, I ended up in law by accident. And they used this nice Chinese phrase, which means that the yin is short and the yang is wrong, right? That there was no plan to this. But when they get into practice as corporate lawyers, which was an unexpected path, usually they're recruited because they had good grades and went to a good law school, they realize the salary is great, and they're much more explicit about valuing salary. I think American law students tend to be more coy about it and self-conscious about valuing salary. Craft satisfaction is high. That sense of doing what you studied comes up a lot. Well, this is what I studied, so it feels good to actually apply it. A sense of accomplishment, prestige, much higher than they expected. They always thought lawyers were sort of lower or didn't know much about lawyers. But actually, my classmates think this is a glamorous job. Lawyers are, in this sector, are well-educated intellectuals. So that's all a pleasant surprise, right? It inverts the American narrative. For the American students, the expectations are so high. This is going to be personally fulfilling. Coming to law school, I'm going to find this civic calling. And go into big law, and often they're describing it as something that's very unfulfilling and not expressive. In the Chinese example, students are primed initially to think about their careers often in terms of sacrifice. Sorry, that'll come up on the next slide. In terms of sacrifice, and without a lot of sense of personal choice and why they chose to enter the profession, and then they're pleasantly surprised by it. So there's something about the expectations that's interesting to learn from here. And when it comes to the lawyer identity, most of the quotes here have to do with feeling pretty natural as a lawyer. There's not a great tension with personal identity. The lawyer role, including my training, has a big impact on my character. Law students come out with similar ways of thinking. This idea that I've adopted a new identity, I've joined this fellowship of lawyers, this profession, and it impacts who I am, and I'm not sort of pushing back against that. On the other hand, they emphasize the sacrifice. So I feel like I sacrifice myself for my family. And I think in the West, the notion of sacrifice carries some pretty heavy connotations that are not the same in the Chinese tradition. So you see that immediately saying that they feel like they're sacrificing, this respondent says, I'm proud to be able to provide for my family. So this 20th century notion of eating bitterness, deeper Confucian notions of sacrificing to benefit other people in the social order. It's both instrumental and sacrificial, but it's also fulfilling at the same time. So let's look at this through another example. These three across the center are family roles: husband, father, son. Friend, travel mate is an interesting one. Lawyer, maybe someone from China can explain travel mate. This is sort of a sort of new term that has to do with linking up with other travel friends through meetups online and things like that. That was the explanation that the respondent gave me. And lawyers on the top. And so this, again, sort of reaffirms some of the discussion we've been having. Families in the center, all the roles are inside. Lawyer is in the cluster. It's not the most central, but it's in the cluster. There aren't many signs of ambivalence or tension within the map. But I want to transition to talking about this advice giver role as a way of thinking about the civic contribution that these lawyers hope to make. So the literature suggests that Chinese lawyers aren't very civic-minded, that they're tending to think about lawyering as just a job, that there's not a great sort of professional socialization process during law school that gets them thinking about. And then also, we'll talk about this at the end, but that law has a different role in society, right? And lawyers have a more limited role. But what's going on with this advice giving? So he says, as a labor law attorney, friends call me up to ask legal questions. When I'm not busy, I'll give them some advice. Maybe it's different from America. Here, if people find out you're a lawyer, even if they're just a friend of a friend, they'll call you directly, right? This is common. If it's not too distant of a connection, I can usually help them out. A lot of the lawyers talk about this. You have to think about a context where there aren't as many lawyers. The older generation, in particular, very, very few lawyers. It's a new profession. And so they're fielding legal questions in their personal life. And this is a form of, I would say, pro bono. This is a civic contribution, even though pro bono is not practiced. So there's some pro bono in some of these firms. Usually it's not litigation. It's more like philanthropy, volunteering, some legal consciousness awareness. And these associates do emphasize those sort of activities. they don't raise these rights protection cases much in the interviews on their own, but when I ask about pro bono and rights protection lawyers as controversial lawyers, they respond very positively and even generally express an interest in taking cases like this in the future. What about corporate law itself as a public contribution, particularly in a society that's still liberalizing the economy and in the relatively early stages of producing a rule of law system after the sort of Maoist regime of legal nihilism and the Deng regime of lawyers being embedded in the state? What about corporate law as a public contribution? They also respond positively to this, although they don't often bring it up on their own. I ask a question about how important making a public contribution is. Usually the answer is very important, and not a lot of elaboration. But when I ask about things like, what's the impact on the economy, they have things to say. They're ready with things to say. So there are some maybe sort of latent civic attributes of these young lawyers. One lawyer says, corporate law resolves contradictions in society, promotes the development of business, benefits the economy, perfects and develops law. Some very high aspirations for the bar and the corporate bar. So how do they adopt these civic ideals if law school is not inculcating them? In the US, we like to think that law school is promoting civic ideals, although my research contradicts that to some extent. So it's largely happening on the job. Law school is not teaching you to be a lawyer in China. It's just teaching you the law. And that's true in most countries. So it's an informal apprenticeship. Most of these lawyers, well, the lawyers in foreign firms are not going for licensure because they're not allowed to be licensed lawyers if they're working for a foreign firm. So they don't even have that socialization. The domestic lawyers do have to go through a government-run training that deals with ethics, politics, and comes with an exam, and they have to bring in 10 cases that they were working on. But in both cases, there's some international influence through contact with foreign lawyers, foreign legal matters, and foreign language, in particular English, which it was very interesting. In the first several interviews, I found that everyone was dropping in sort of 1 to 2 English words per sentence in our conversations. And I started asking them, are you doing this for my benefit because I'm a second language speaker? And they consistently said, no, this is our language in the office. It's this sort of Creole of Chinese and English in terms of legal terms, but not just legal terms, right? Terms even about professional life, some of the questions we've been discussing today. Things like work-life balance are often said in English. Things like pro bono. There are various terms for pro bono in Chinese, but often they use the American term. The English term, I'll emphasize American because most countries don't do as much pro bono, and these firms are American. And then also grammatical terms. They're just sort of English is sprinkled in because it's a very international setting. And when I ask them sort of the difference between Chinese and American lawyers, usually they de-emphasize these differences. They say, well, the way of thinking about law is relatively similar. We're part of this international bar. And maybe a media influence, because there are a lot of references to The Good Wife and Suits, and sort of thinking about what being a lawyer means has a foreign media influence in a lot of these accounts. I don't know if those shows, I don't watch those shows. I don't know if they emphasize a lot of civic contributions or not. But this idea that you're a lawyer, it's different from being a business person. That's consistent. These lawyers, when I ask them, how is being a lawyer different from a business person, they feel like being a lawyer is a strong sense of professional identity. You have different ethics. You have different civic callings. You're not just doing transactions. So what are the internal implications? And I'll put this back into comparative conversation with the US case. When we think about alienation at work, and this is something sociologists talk about, that when you become a professional, you become detached from a lot of your personal values and ideas. You become a specialized instrument within a larger system. But those perspectives usually emphasize market forces and organizational structures. And I think what my work shows is that deeper cultural understandings about the self are also pervasive have a pervasive influence on how alienation is experienced. So whether you think about, so one way of putting this is maybe there's less alienation in the Chinese context. The lawyer role is more central, so maybe there's just less alienation. Or there's different ways of combating alienation. So in the Chinese context, you combat work alienation with Confucian values, which is actually a somewhat surprising finding because the media and discourse in China generally describes this generation as relatively selfish and anti-Confucian and materialistic. This is the post-90s graduation, and I see some acknowledgement. But they're combating it with this strong sense of sort of family value. That, okay, there's some alienation at work, but I'm doing something for my family. Whereas in the US context, you combat it with this role distance, the sense of, well, it doesn't express who I am. I'm just playing a role. There may be some external implications. This is more speculative, but what do these findings say about lawyers' capacity to make civic contributions or to play a role in social change? It's a big question in the US context. Are lawyers good at promoting social change or not? In China, although there's some values that the lawyers express in this arena, they're really constrained by law being primarily a state project in China rather than a tool for social change. Within a socialist rule of law paradigm, and that's the term that the party has used since 2006, law is a tool of legitimacy. Law serves to facilitate the economy and provide the party with a sense of legitimacy. Lawyers have a marginal status in the broader socialist context. This is one of the leading scholars in the Chinese legal profession. And then thinking about these associates, they lack autonomy at work. They don't have a lot of autonomy. Neither do the US associates. But these associates are, I don't know if you remember seeing the word students on a couple of the maps. Even though they're already lawyers, they often identify with terms like employee, student, even subordinate came up a couple times. And in the domestic firms, your first year in law is called first grade. And it's the same word that's used in elementary school and in college. So you're sort of in this, and then each year you get a chance to move up to the next year, the next grade. So there's not a strong sense of autonomy, and this is supported by some other research. So these civic contributions are really constrained. And I'll wrap up there and just put up these two maps that we saw. So this is Chen, the first Chinese example we saw, and this is Sarah, the drifting path, 2L, who placed the big law role on the periphery. I'm happy to hear your comments and questions. Yeah?
That was really interesting. Thank you. I'd be curious to see in the North American context if it would break out any differently if you separated by maybe like class lines or parental income, if that would weigh either for taking a more instrumental view of the job or perhaps weigh in the opposite direction, and that maybe if you grew up with low income, you'd be more committed to public interest. So I was wondering if you got a sense for that.
So it's a near and dear topic to me, and I've done some extra sort of informal interviewing in this area. There's a first-generation professionals group at Berkeley Law where I was doing my PhD, and I was a member of that group, and I sort of participated in their meetings. And I think that I think it's a key factor when you talk about drift, right? Because the financial necessity account can be much more real for students from first generation. The sense of risk for passing up on the big law opportunity is much higher, much more real. And I think it can cut both ways in terms of professional identity, though. So in the sense that working in big law can be more instrumentalized because it's really sort of like the Chinese accounts. It's really to provide for family in a pretty direct way in a lot of cases. My respondents are going through the recession context in a way that you are not now. So the risks are even higher. At the same time, the financial necessity argument is more real, so it's less of a sense of selling out, it's more a sense of necessity, and I think that cuts against the self-shaming sellout narrative to some extent. But I think there are a lot of specific challenges to first-generation professional law students that are not emphasized enough in the literature, and that could also explain experiences of distancing from lawyer identity. So it's more disparate from previous identities that you've had or that your family has had. And so the idea of embracing this role, it's more of a distance to cover. And so there's other factors, right, that would help to explain why some students place the lawyer role in the periphery. Race and gender may also be included there, but my data aren't as strong on those variables. So it's more speculative. Yeah? Yeah, that'd be an interesting comparison. So friend does come up in the US context quite a bit. But the US students are in law school, and law school is a pretty intense environment where sometimes peer connections are a way that students cope and survive. So there's a particular role for friend there. So yeah, that may speak to questions about, in another chapter, I look at a lot of the peer dynamics and experiences of peer pressure to give accounts of public interest idealism among your peers that I think lead first-year students to harshly judge corporate law, even more than they would if they were sort of looking at it on their own. And so peer dynamics end up being really important. So it's an interesting issue. Yeah?
So just contrasting the two, that in the Chinese examples, there seems to be less of an emphasis on the self. So I wonder if there's any connection that you can draw between like Maslow's hierarchy. It seems like in the Chinese case there's less emphasis on self-actualization.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maslow's, I'll have to think about that. That's very interesting. Yeah. So, and there's interesting psychological research on EastWest comparison and thinking about the self that shows that in the East, people tend to think about the self from a third-party perspective. So like when you look at how people think about their memories, they tend to take a third-party perspective where they're looking at themselves from the outside and concerned about how they fit into the structure. Whereas Westerners tend to think from the first-person perspective and assume that everyone else has the same emotions as them. And that's sort of interesting, like laboratory, like peer-reviewed comparison. So there are some of those deep differences going on. Yeah.
So I'm curious if you ever thought of doing this with Chinese law students, like in the undergraduate situation, because obviously once you are already a lawyer, there is a little bit of personal justification sometimes that goes on in your head. Whereas these students, while they might have committed to big law, at the same time, there's still sort of an illusion of potential choice out there where they could change their minds. So I'm wondering if you thought about that or have surveyed Chinese law students.
I would love to, and I'm hoping to use this project as a springboard to apply for funding for a larger scale study. I think this was a nice entry point because these lawyers are just starting to grapple, like you said, they've already become lawyers, but it happens so fast, they're just really starting to grapple with professional identity. Whereas in school, the identity is much more that you're a student and you're trying to get good grades. Whereas the law students in the US are thinking about law school both as an opportunity to be a good student, but also it's professionalization, right? You're learning how to be a lawyer. That you're learning how to think like a lawyer, you're not just learning the law. That's why we, in 1L classes, don't teach the law in a straightforward way. It would be much more efficient to just sort of give you the horn book and say, these are the law. You could do it in 2 weeks probably. But instead, it's a process of learning to become a lawyer in your thought processes, right? So it's like a question of where the professionalization happens. And I think in the Chinese context, it happens at the beginning of practice. And in the US context, it happens in law school. And actually, because a lot of the Chinese lawyers have only an undergraduate law degree, a lot of the young lawyers are in a similar sort of stage of life as the US JD students, right? They're coming out of undergraduate. And yeah, so there's interesting comparisons in this approach, but I do hope to go back to legal education and look at what students start with. Are there ideals at the start? I mean, at this point, they're reflecting on it and saying, I came into law school totally by accident, and that seems plausible. But to actually talk to them and see what they're hoping for at age 18 or 19 at the beginning of law school and see how that changes, that would be fascinating. I do hope to follow up on that. And yeah.
This is kind of the flip side of that question. You said you also talk, or I assume you talk to beginning associates in the U.S.?
Yeah.
So did you have them fill out a similar map?
I did.
Okay.
It's a smaller sample, but I did. And they tended to show similar maps to what they showed in 2L, which is a little disappointing. I mean, you might hope that in some sense, this role distancing is an initial reaction and it dissipates when you actually get into practice. And hopefully it does. I'm only talking about the first couple years. But a lot of these people, especially the ones who drifted, still weren't feeling very good about working in big law. So for example, one person I talked to was doing IP because she thought it was the least dirty practice area. But she has no technical sort of scientific background in the subject matter of the cases. And so the work is very dry and uninteresting. And she said that she's reduced to basically putting together these binders of expert reports that she doesn't personally understand. And to make it worse, she's looking at her friends in the white-collar criminal defense practice who are doing this really engaging work that she would love on a day-to-day basis, but she still feels this kind of moral judgment about it. That white-collar criminal defense is too distant. I initially wanted to be a public defender. Now I'm going to be a white-collar defender. It's just too much of a leap from where I started. And so that sense of moral distancing can be sustained during practice, although I can't talk about whether that's a generalizable finding. Hopefully it's not. Yeah?
Could there be a selection bias for people who respond to these things that they think more about their identities generally than those who don't respond?
Right. So there could be. So the thing about qualitative research is that you're really generating hypotheses that are not necessarily perfectly generalizable to other settings. But you're generating theory and hypotheses and sort of ideal types. And I do my best to get an unbiased sample. It's not a very purposive sample. Mostly it's drawn through asking for volunteering. But who volunteers? Maybe it tends to be people who, I think there's different categories. One of the categories is people who are worried about identity and want to sit in a confidential setting and talk about themselves and get free therapy. Another category, people interested in social science, and that's sort of biased. People who like to think about roles and they think, oh, that'll be a fun hour, or they like the idea of supporting this young social scientist. Like, sure, I'll volunteer for you because I like social science. Other people are just sort of, I'm a Berkeley Law graduate. There's sort of a sense of loyalty, right? So it's like, oh yeah, I'll help this guy out. Maybe he'll help me out when I'm trying to get a job later or something. So there's different categories. I don't think any of these biases are extremely troubling, though. So there may be, and also this site, because it's a public interest-oriented culture, and I'm not saying that it's Berkeley because I'm to be very cautious about IRB. I'm not supposed to say where it was. But it's a public interest-oriented West Coast public law school in the top 10. So public interest career options are on people's minds more than at most law schools. Big law is on people's minds more than most law schools, not here, but most law schools. And that's not representative, but it provides a nice kind of contrast to think about these ideal types, and then we can think about doing more macro representative kind of research. Do we usually wrap up now to give people? I have a class to attend anyways.
All right, well then let's wrap up. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.